Hello, everyone, and welcome to this BABS learning session on vocal production. Just before we get started, we're going to just go through some online learning etiquette very quickly. We're more than happy to answer any questions, but with so many participants, we need to keep it structured well. So if you do find that you have a question or something isn't clear, please type it in the Zoom chat, and my co-host Rob will keep an eye on those questions, and I'll refer to him to present those questions at the end of the session, just because we have so much information to get through in such a short amount of time. If you want to retract a question, just let Rob know in the chat, and he'll make sure that he doesn't ask that question, and we will endeavour to have answered all the questions by the end of today's session. Please also keep your video switched off and also your microphones muted so that we can cut down on background noise for the other participants. Great. Uh, Obviously, this is all about vocal production, and session one, if it will move on to it, uh, we are going to, the aim of this presentation is to give you the best understanding of how you produce voice and try and help you to become an efficient singer and the most efficient you can be. I like this acronym that I came up. It's called ABLE. I wrote it to summarize the key information required for efficient vocal production. And one of the reasons I particularly like it is because everyone is able to learn to sing using this information. And whilst that is a really, really cheesy statement, it's also true. So hopefully you find this helpful. And the first thing we're going to talk about is alignment. Now, I know this has been covered a lot in recent years, so we'll just go on a whistle-stop tour on what we need to think about when we're thinking about alignment. So postural alignment or alignment is basically just the way we stand and the way we should always stand when we're singing, but also actually in everyday life to give ourselves the most healthy body posture. So when we go when we stand up to sing or stand up generally, we want to make sure that our feet are roughly hip width apart. And if you jump on the spot, then wherever you land should be roughly where your feet should be. We then want to make sure our hips are over our heels, and be careful that your hips are not rolled backwards and they're kind of parallel with the floor. And you want to keep your knees nice and loose. So we don't want any locked knees. We also don't want knees that are overly bent. We just want them nice and relaxed. Then we want to make sure that your shoulders are over your hips and that the ears of your ear holes, the holes of your ears are directly over the tallest part of your shoulder. And this gives us a really great posture. And if you have your ears over your tallest part of your shoulder, you should be able to draw an infinity sign with your nose, like so. It should be nice and easy, and there shouldn't be any kind of jolting in it, because otherwise you're not really in a good postural alignment. Freedom of movement is key in singing. The reason for that is because the muscles we use when we sing and breathe are also the muscles we use to stand up and keep ourselves aligned. So if we want to sing with a free quality, which we do as barbershop singers definitely, and also most other types of singing, then we want to make sure that the rest of the muscles in our body have this free, easy movement, and we're not tensing anything up. If there is tension in your body, then there'll be tension in your voice. So we want to make sure we sing without tension. And if you want to make sure there's no tension in your voice and to make sure your body is really nice and free, you can do a kind of figure of eight side to side with your hips. And that will keep your vocal folds nice and free. It's impossible to get a really nice, smooth, free movement with your hips going side to side and to have tension in your vocal folds at the same time. We should also be aware that there are some health factors that can cause difficulties with getting perfect alignment or the best alignment we can, such as fused vertebrae, and that may limit one's ability to have optimal postural alignment. But if we do our best to try and get as close to it as we can, then we're giving ourselves the best chance at having a nice, free sounding voice. Good. So that's all on alignment. As I said, most of us have covered that before, so we don't need to spend too long on that. Next, we're going to talk about breathing. And breathing is one of those things that shouldn't be too complex, but for some reason there's lots of disagreements about how we should breathe. So let's just break this down a little. Um, One thing we all know, or should all know, is that the air is the fuel of the voice. And without air coming up from our lungs through our vocal folds, we can't actually produce sound. Air flows from the lungs through the trachea and through to the vocal folds. And we can see it on this picture here. Here are your lungs. The air comes up through the trachea and through the vocal folds. Um, Respiration or breathing is a cyclical process, and it happens in four stages. You inspire, you take in the air. There's then a transition phase, and then you expire, and then there's a transition phase back to normal, back to inspiration. When we're considering this, we should also consider that why this breathing happens. Breathing happens because of the pressure difference in your lungs in comparison to the outside world. And so, if you have a high pressure in your lungs, and a lower pressure outside your lungs, the pressure receptors in your lungs communicate that to your brain, and basically you open your vocal folds and the air rushes out to the outside world. And then the reverse happens. There's little pressure in your lungs and higher pressure in the outside world, and so the air rushes back the other way. And so that's why we breathe naturally without thinking about it. And although we can override the system to breathe, when in everyday life we breathe that way all the time. The next important thing to note is that lungs have no muscles of their own. Instead, they rely on three groups of muscles to make respiration happen. So they rely on the diaphragm, the intercostal muscles, and the abdominal muscles. Now, the intercostal muscles are the muscles between your ribs. Uh, the abdominal muscles are the ones where some people have six packs, but I certainly don't. And the diaphragm is quite a big muscle that sits underneath your rib cage. So as you can see from this picture, the diaphragm is a dome-shaped muscle that sits underneath the lungs um, and helps us to breathe in everyday life. As you can see from this diagram, the one on the left, during inhalation, the diaphragm contracts and flattens and basically moves down, and that allows the air to enter your lungs. And as you exhale, the diaphragm relaxes and moves upwards, and the air is released back into the world. So when we sing, we sometimes see singers breathe up into their uh, with their shoulders, and we call this clavicular breathing. Now, this isn't a great technique for breathing because it means that you're not using your diaphragm, as you can see from the example here, and it takes a lot of effort and has a very low volume of air entering into your lungs. However, when we use diaphragmatic breathing and we use that diaphragm, you can see the air rushes in. There's bigger space for the air to go in, so you get a much higher volume. It's low effort because we do it all the time. We are naturally geared that way. Our muscle memory knows that's what we do to breathe, and we give ourselves a maximum fuel for the voice. So this is just a screen to compare the two types of breathing. And this is all well and good, and it's great that we know that one type of breathing is more optimal than the others, but how does that actually feed into our singing? And we're going to explore that. So we're going to talk about splat breathing. Splat breathing is a technique from Janice Chapman, who has written and researched singing and teaching singing method, and she describes splat as singers, please loosen abdominal tension. And what is at the heart of this is that we want to lower that diaphragm very quickly to allow the maximum amount of air to rush in when we take a breath as a singer. If we just release our abdomen, then we allow air to automatically rush in because of our normal breathing patterns that happen. And in that way, we can breathe in 0.2 seconds. And with that in mind, we don't need to take a breath. We actually fill our lungs to the optimal capacity for singing and speaking, and we don't overfill. Um, if we take a big breath, a singer's breath, we were all young once, and we all probably at school had a teacher who said, take a big breath before you sing this next phrase. And you go, and you take a really big breath and your vocal folds slam shut to try and keep the air in, and there's a big amount of pressure uh, in your lungs. And as soon as you let go, as soon as you release the vocal folds, air just goes straight out, and it goes out faster than actually if you take less air and just fill it up to uh, an optimal amount, at which point the air glides out in a more controlled manner and you can more easily control your airflow. A good way to think of this is thinking of a balloon. So if you fill up a balloon till it's really, really full, and you hold the end and then you let go, it kind of goes, and the air rushes out as fast as it can, and the end of the balloon is totally uncontrollable. If you were to fill up that balloon to just over the point where it starts, where it stops you blowing up, so you're just over the point where it you could blow it properly up if you wanted to. That point where you can't quite get over as a child. If you blow it up like that, then and you let go, then you notice that the air just kind of trickles out, and there's no big uh, issue with the end going. And that's the same with your vocal folds, in effect. So what we want is if we have optimal breathing, then your vocal folds aren't stressed. Your vocal folds, as we'll go on to in a minute, uh, are only a small part of your anatomy, and are very sensitive and are very easily damaged. And if you take too much breath, you can cause yourself real issues later on by damaging them. So we want to make sure that we only take the optimum breath. So we're going to do an exercise now, which is a splat breathing exercise. So let's all join in. I can't see you because all your screens are turned off, but I'm going to trust that you join in. And basically, I want you to just stand up, making sure we've got good postural alignment. And as we discussed before, everything aligned. And what I want you to do is I want you to exhale as much air as you can and then hold for 5 seconds. And then all I want you to do is release your abdomen muscles. I don't want you to take a breath. I just want you to let them go. And we're going to do that thing that we tend not to want to do in society, which is just let our gut out. And lots of us have been brought up to kind of hold ourselves in to make ourselves look as thin as possible. We want to forget that in singing. In singing, no one's looking at your midriff. They're all looking at your face and looking at your emotional enjoyment of the piece or engagement of the piece. So let's stand up. Let's exhale everything. And we're going to hold for 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and just let go. Did that work for you? Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. It's your first time. Let's try again. So, still standing with good postural alignment, and exhale. And then hold 4, 3, 2, 1, and then release and let the air rush in. Good. Now, some of you are going to say, if you manage to get that to work that time, you're going to say, well, hang on, that's all well and good, but I don't feel like I've taken any air in because I haven't actively chosen to breathe. And that's a fair point. But as I said earlier, because we're looking for the optimum amount of air and air pressure in those lungs, actually, you don't have to take a breath. You don't have to take a breath, as it were. You just need to allow the air in. And it should be enough to see you right to the ends of phrases that you normally sing. Now, when you first move to this type of breathing, should you wish to, then you might find that your phrases can't be quite as long as they used to be. And that's probably more to do with your air control as you sing rather than the amount of air you're taking in. So it might take some time to transition to being able to have as long singing as long of phrases as you did before. But once you do manage to get this down and use this, you'll find that you can actually sing for longer than you did before. To help with that uh, exhaling of air, and to make sure we're really helping ourselves be able to splat breathe, we want to make sure that we imagine. I very rarely use imagery in my teaching, but this is the one thing I do use. If you imagine at your navel, there's a piece of string that is connected to your back where your bra strap would be, so up there. And as you exhale, as you sing, if you bring your tummy in and up along that axis, that will give you, that will allow you to then, when you release your gut, give your gut further to go and more air to easily rush in. So we're just going to try that splat exercise twice more, this time with your tummy coming in and up along that navel to bra strap axis. So let's try it one more time. We're going to breathe out, keep it going in and up, and hold. 4, 3, 2, 1, and release. Good. And one last time. Exhale. Yep. And keep it going up. Get it going out along that axis and hold. 4, 3, 2, 1, and release. Hopefully that worked even better than last time for you. So that's breathing. As I said before, there are many other schools of thoughts on breathing, but the reason I like this method is it's scientific based. It's based on peer-reviewed research. It also follows the natural body pattern of breathing, so we don't have to overwork ourselves. And whilst there are other schools of thought that have worked for hundreds of years and work perfectly well, this one uh, I find works really well. And as I said, scientific evidence shows that it's optimal. And that's the thing. We want to be the best we can be by being optimal and efficient. So that's why it's so good. Good. Next, we're going to talk about the larynx. Now, this encompasses several parts, and it's quite a long topic. Both larynx and expression are longer topics. As you'll know, I've got 2 sessions. The second one this afternoon is at 4 o'clock, and we will discuss the second half of the larynx during that time. But first off, we're just going to discuss phonation during this presentation. So, voice is produced by the process of the vocal folds vibrating. And if you feel your Adam's apple, or your Eve's apple, I guess, because you have them ladies as well, if you put your fingers there and do a little bit of humming or talking, you'll feel that your vocal folds are there and they vibrate. So it's just like a guitar. If you pluck a string, the string vibrates and it then resonates in the body of the guitar, and then sound is produced. The vocal folds are made of smooth, thin tissue, and the vocal folds are located in the larynx, which is just here in this little box here. So we said before, so we said below this are the trachea and the lungs, and your vocal folds just sit at the top here, and this bit here is your epiglottis, which covers over when you swallow food, water, saliva, etc., to protect your lungs from those things. And if you choke, if you find that water's gone down the wrong way, which we've all had happen from time to time, you'll find that it's your vocal folds that are really sore after you've started coughing, and that's because they were originally a secondary defense and still act as such to stop water, etc., going into your lungs. That's why you'll find if you've got a bad cough, or as I said, if you choke, you'll find that your vocal folds your voice feels really sore afterwards, and sometimes you can't speak for a little bit. And that's because when you cough, your vocal folds just kind of slam together really hard and open and close, and so it basically causes inflammation on those vocal folds. So if you've had a choking fit at the start of a rehearsal, I suggest you kind of sit out for 10 minutes, drink some water, relax, and just wait for them to kind of normalize a little bit. So, as I said, the vocal folds are located in the larynx, and this is the only rigid structure in the body that's not stabilized by joints connected to the skeleton. So it's held entirely in place by muscular activity only. So nothing to do with any bones, which is slightly odd. It's the only structure in the body. Good. So what actually happens? Well, this is what we call the Bernoulli effect. And as we talked about before, when we allow air into the lungs and it fills up, we have something called subglottal pressure, or pressure in the lungs. That's just what it means. It just means below the glottis, your glottis being where your vocal folds are housed. Sorry. So once we've filled up our lungs with air to an optimal pressure, we then allow the air to go the other way and exit the body, but it goes through the vocal folds, and as it pushes up through the vocal folds, it creates phonation, and it happens in this weird little way here where it cycles very, very quickly through the gap, and it keeps opening and closing, and this happens at an extremely fast rate that's not visible to the naked eye. So I'm going to next show you some video of some vocal folds, and I think it's 4 singers who are singing, and you'll hopefully see the vocal folds in action, and you'll probably ask, well, hang on, don't seem to be moving very fast. Actually, they're moving so fast you can't see. The camera hasn't got a quick enough set of, the camera isn't quick enough to pick up the movements. So let's have a look at this video.
Sean, sorry, there doesn't seem to be any sound coming through on these videos.
Okay, right. Let's fix that then. Okay, everyone, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for 2 seconds. I apologize, everyone. Let's try this again. Hopefully you can hear it now. Good. Okay, so here we can see the vocal folds, and here you can see the vocal folds apart, and this is the alto singing, and she is breathing here, and so there's no phonation going on, so her vocal folds don't meet at all. Over here on the left-hand side, this is a soprano. I'm afraid this is classical, as some might term it. It's actually Renaissance music, which is fairly old. Unfortunately, we don't have any scoping of barbershop singers singing barbershop yet, but maybe one day soon. Anyway, this is the soprano here, and you can see her vocal folds are just apart there, but she's singing, and basically they're moving apart and together so often that you can't see it, as I said before. Over on the right here, this is the tenor, and the same thing's happening. You can see that the vocal folds are meeting at the bottom there, and if we're absolutely efficient as singers, these should meet fully. There may be a particular reason. It might just be midway through a cycle, and that's why we're seeing it like this. But yes, and over here, this is the bass, and you can't see the vocal folds right now because the bass is swallowing. And so the epiglottis, which is here on this particular one, and here on these two, this bottom bit, folds over while the saliva goes down to the stomach. Isn't that lovely? Good. Okay, so let's move on. The next thing I want to talk about is, especially in male barbershop, is the difference between head voice and falsetto. Male singers have falsetto. Women don't technically have falsetto. It's termed something else and is slightly different. Perhaps we can go into that another time. But the main difference between head voice and falsetto, well, in fact, I can't do falsetto very well, but we'll watch the video. But the main difference is that in head voice, even though we're going high, our vocal folds meet fully. But in falsetto singing, our vocal folds actually vibrate in a different way. So they don't use the Ben-Louis effect in the same way. The vocal folds don't actually meet, or not often, and instead the vocal folds vibrate from the sides rather than relying on the air itself. And that's why in falsetto, it often sounds very, very breathy because lots of air is escaping. And we'll see in the clip that happening. It's probably also worth mentioning that professional countertenors or professional barbershop tenors are, this happens to them too, but due to back pressure, which we'll talk about in a minute, or supraglottal pressure, their vocal folds actually do end up meeting, even though they are using this same technique to vibrate during their singing. So let's just have a look at the difference between the two. Isn't that fantastic? Let's just take it back and just try and pause it. Oh, no, wrong slide. Never mind. If we just look at this one more time, press play. So here in the falsetto, you can see that the vocal folds are actually really not meeting at all, and it sounds very, very breathy in comparison to the head voice that we're about to hear again. The vocal folds here are fully meeting, and this is how our vocal folds should look when we're singing normally. So yeah, so that's the difference between head voice and falsetto. People often ask, you know, how can am I singing with falsetto? Am I singing with head voice? What's the difference? The truth is, it's very hard to tell when someone's singing at you and you're trying to assess in person without scoping them, without doing this. And this is a nasendoscopy. So the camera goes up your nose and down into your throat. And without doing that, sometimes it's very hard to tell, especially with very good tenors in the barbershop world, whether it's falsetto or not, whether they're actually using head voice and the folds are fully meeting, or if they're singing with that falsetto and the vocal folds are still meeting, but because they're such good singers. Or it's sometimes easier to say if it's just falsetto in an untrained tenor, just because you can hear the breathiness in the voice. And you know, again, it just takes training to train into having this full closure the best we can. Good. The next bit we're going to talk about, and actually the last bit we're going to talk about, is in phonation, is what we call SOVT exercises, or semi-occluded vocal tract exercises. So semi-occluded vocal tract is pretty much what it says in the very wordy tin. This is where you partially close the vocal tract to create what we call supraglottal pressure or back pressure. The reason this is good is because it eases the strain on the vocal folds by creating a smaller difference in the amount of pressure when the semi-occluded vocal tract exercises are used. So in effect, if we're trying to sing high and we especially haven't warmed up yet, then we're probably going to find that we're using a lot of pressure from the lungs and it stresses out the vocal folds. How we said earlier that, you know, too much air going through can really stress them out. This supraglottal pressure or back pressure means that we can ease the vocal folds and give them a calmer environment to work in, so the air doesn't rush out in quite as fast as it perhaps would. So many of you will have done semi-occluded vocal tract exercises without even thinking about it, because your chorus directors or coaches will have done them with you, and perhaps you've not realized what they are. But they are simple things like V sounds or other fricatives. And as you can tell from that, if you will do that at home, you'll realize if you put your hand in front of your lips, actually you're not getting much air out at all. My favorite one is trumpeting or puffy lips. So basically, imagine you've got almost a teaspoon of air just behind your front two lips. That one means that the air pretty much comes out your nose instead of your mouth. So that's always good fun. Lots of people use humming, and this has been used for uh, many, many years. So you'll often find at the start of rehearsal, people say, let's start by doing a hum. And it's now been scientifically proven in the last, I think in the last 5 years, there was a paper written that basically said that humming is not an effective SOVT exercise. There is nothing in your nasal cavity where if you are using humming or an M sound or an NG sound, those sounds are produced by air coming out of your nose. And if you push your nose, then it stops. But there's nothing actually between your vocal folds and the air coming out of your nose to actually create as much back pressure as some of these other ones. Another really good one is rolled R's, or bubbling in the barbershop world, which isn't probably a good thing right now. But one of my other favorite ones is rolling your R's and bubbling at the same time. It creates even more back pressure than just doing one of those on their own. Lots of you will have been around convention centers where lots of people are singing into straws in water. And some of you may be wondering what this is. And this is something called Lax Vox. It was designed originally as a speech and language therapy technique to try and help restore voices. But what they found is that it's actually the most effective SOVT exercise there is. Although the straws should be small, roughly 3.5 millimeters in diameter. You might want to go slightly bigger for comfort, but they found optimum is about that. And basically, this gives us the most back pressure or supraglottal pressure that we found so far. So this is the best exercise we can do. However, a 3.5 millimeter straw is about the size of a cocktail straw, so it's small. It's not the kind of McDonald's size straws, and whilst you can use those, they're not going to give you as good a supraglottal pressure as one of these smaller straws. You also don't need to necessarily buy a special straw to do it. You just need to find a straw that is the right size, and but obviously we want to save the world and we don't want to waste plastic, etc. So there are reusable straws out there that is probably best to go for, but if you want to use that, that's great, and it is effective and it is helpful. But in reality, some of these other exercises are almost as good and don't require you to carry equipment around with you. You don't have to carry a straw and you don't have to carry a bottle of water to do it into. I mean, one of the other good reasons for using Lax Vox or this phonating into the straw into water is it gives a it gives a visual as to how you're doing as a singer. So if you're singing into a straw, and I don't have one with me, I'm afraid, but if you're singing through your straw into bubbling in water, then we want to keep the bubbles fairly consistent, and we don't want to suddenly change big changes in the how the bubbles react. Basically, what we want is a kind of very smooth transition in the bubbles as you perhaps go up a scale. You'll find that as you go up scales, on the top notes, the bubbles will be slightly faster than on the lower notes. And this is because we require more, more air to produce higher notes, and we know that scientifically again. So you will see that, but it should still be a very smooth transition within the bubbles as they change, rather than kind of suddenly bubbly and then not bubbly and then bubbly again. And so it gives a really good visual aid as to how well your consistency of air is in comparison to how you're phonating. And so realistically, it just shows you whether you're being efficient with your air or not. Good. Um, so that's SOVT exercises, and that's where we're going to finish for this session. Rob, are there any questions on anything we've discussed? And I'm aware we've discussed lots and lots and lots of things.
Yeah, we've had a few. And first one is actually one that I've got. I've noticed when I've been singing choruses and doing bubbling exercises that some people have struggled to be able to maintain a bubble. So sometimes they've got to pinch the sides of their mouths to keep a sustained bubble. Physiologically, what's happening which is preventing them from bubbling consistently on their own?
I'll be honest and say I'm not quite sure. It's probably fair to say that we are all slightly different. And actually, bubbling is one of the things I really struggle with myself. I find I lose a lot of air when I bubble, and so I can't do it consistently for very long. And I have the same struggle as other people. I don't think there's technically a reason. It's just some people's dexterity with their lips, maybe. But I don't really know the answer to that, I'm afraid. It's just one of those things. Maybe it's other people have practiced more.
The next question is from Frank. Does the distinction between head voice and falsetto actually matter? That's quite.
Um, in some ways, yes. In some ways, no. It's two ways of producing the same note. And if you use falsetto, you can get higher. So you can reach much higher notes. And if you create enough back pressure by altering your vocal tract, then as I said, your vocal folds close more, and therefore you're not actually using as much air. And so it means you can go for longer. So it depends. It depends if you want to know about it, and if you want to know how to improve. If you want to know, if you're a tenor and you're finding it's hard and it's breathy, then then perhaps it's good to know that there are things you can do about that, and actually what you're doing is a particular thing in your vocal folds, in your larynx, sorry. If you're singing lead and you're finding some of those notes high, and suddenly you kind of go up for a high note and it's very breathy, then you probably know that you're using falsetto, and perhaps we need to find other ways to make the sounds more consistent with the notes that come before and after. And so training into head voice for that particular note might be helpful to give us that consistent sound. So realistically, it's about the outcome of the sound and how it sounds, rather than necessarily knowing the physiological difference between the two. But so I would say yes, it's helpful to know, just so that you can problem solve how to make things sound consistent.
Thank you. And we've had a question from Ben saying, with the SOVT straws, does the length make any difference, or is it just the diameter?
So the recent evidence, which I think was 2017, but don't quote me on that, someone did lots of experiments on different size straws and all sorts of things, and they discovered that actually length didn't seem to really matter. It was more the diameter. Length does play a part, and the longer you make it, the more supraglottal pressure you're going to have, but it's not going to affect it enough to really warrant too much concern. Let's put it that way.
And a question from Tim: why can't we sing or talk when we breathe in?
Well, you can. It just doesn't sound very good. Hello, my name's Sean. It's because, in effect, the noise. Number one, the Bernoulli effect works best in Bernoulli. Sorry, effect works best going upwards through the vocal folds. That's the way that it's supposed to happen. So it's not as efficient going back the other way. But also, the sound is then traveling. If you do it back the other way, hello, then you find that the sound is traveling into your lungs, and your lungs are not a good resonating chamber, unlike your pharynx is, which we'll discuss in the next session. So you'll find that basically the sound doesn't really have a good resonating chamber, and therefore and no exit really. It's just kind of burying itself in your body, so you can't really hear it very well at all. So it's just completely inefficient, but you can technically do it.
What happens internally when we're warmed up vocally?
So quite often it just means that it's like any muscle in the body. So when you're going for a run, you warm up your muscles. I don't do running particularly, so maybe like that, I don't know. And you basically, it makes them more active, more responsive. And so you are able to run for longer, take bigger strides, etc., etc. It's the same with the vocal folds. Basically, your vocal folds become more used to being stretching further apart. Make it being longer, and therefore they're able to cope with the vocal acrobatics of singing much better than going in cold. Because we'll talk about this more in the next session, but when you speak, you tend to speak in a very limited vocal range, and so when we come to singing and we want to really expand our range, we're not used to that at all, and so we have to warm up to make the muscles warm, to be able to stretch to where they need to go consistently, and to produce the right outcome. And then at the end of that, ideally, we should warm back down, just like we do when running, back to our speaking voice, so that we're able to again not damage those muscles, not kind of leave it really tense, etc.
This is a question which is very relevant for all of our friends from labs and Sweden Alpines who are on the sessions. Does wearing high heels affect alignment and voice at all?
Simple answer, it depends. Yes, if you're not used to wearing them. So if you wear high heels, you tend to push your body forward slightly and up. And if you're not used to, I can't say that I wear high heels very often. I'll not lie though, I have worn them before for plays and things, and you suddenly realize when you put them on, you have to hold yourself in a very different way to keep yourself upright. So things are still technically the same. You want your heels and your hips and your shoulders and your ears all aligned. But because your high heels are pushing you kind of forward, you just need to kind of realign with it. So if you are wearing heels for competition or a show, practice in them. Don't leave it to the day, because it will really affect how you actually produce your sound. And so if you've ever had that where you've just gone on stage with high heels and not practicing them before, you might find that it has an adverse effect on your vocal quality and your ability to breathe easily, as well as all those pressures from being on stage, of course.
How you mentioned earlier about warming down. What kind of exercises or would you normally do when you're warming down after singing?
So I would basically do the sorts of things we do for warm-ups, but in reverse. So instead of trying to get higher and lower than you normally do, take it from the extreme. Well, not the extreme, but take it from fairly high and fairly low and work back to where you normally speak. So if I'd been singing lead, for example, I might have been singing Fs, Gs, maybe even A flats if I'm really feeling adventurous. So I wouldn't start that high. I'd probably start around a D and just start to da 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 da, and I probably do it also on those SOVT exercises, and just work down, going downwards back to where my normal speaking voice is, which is probably around a bottom A or something. So, and then when you finally kind of get to that comfortable zone where you normally talk, just just continue those SOVT exercises just for 30 seconds or so, just where you normally speak, just to really make sure it's home and that's where it's used to being. So yeah, just warm up in reverse, basically. It shouldn't take long, maybe 5 minutes. And if you've got time at the end of rehearsals, I'd always encourage my singers after rehearsal to do it straight away when they're putting down the risers, just to really make sure that it's warmed down.
Great, thank you. We're just going to ask the last couple of questions now. We're coming to the end of the session.
Okay.
Do complex chorus moves like crouching and sitting affect your vocal production, and how can you mitigate against that?
Yes, they certainly do. As a chorus director myself, when we're setting moves, I always ask whoever's choreographing, is that a word? Yeah, whoever the choreographer is, to make sure that we haven't got positions that really disrupt, for example, the upper body. So I try and make sure that from our waistband up is always in alignment and try and get our heads aligned wherever possible. So I don't want this and then us looking like that because that stretches here, or I don't want us looking down, etc. So I will work with the choreographer to try and ensure that whatever moves we put in, whilst looking effective, don't affect the instrument itself, because that's the number one way to really cause our singing to go off track.
One last one. Can you quickly explain a bit more about the female equivalent of falsetto or head voice, or is that too big a question to ask in 3 minutes?
It's right. Okay. So we have 4 modes of the voice. I'm probably going to get all their names wrong, but basically M0, M1, M2, M3, and that's in both female and male. In males, we have what we call vocal fry. We've all done that before, especially when we got up in the morning and are perhaps not feeling ourselves after a night before. And then we have what we call modal voice in both, which is our normal singing voice that some of us might consider chest voice. And then basically women tend to go into head voice and then whistle tone, and then men go through it to to falsetto instead of whistle tone, I think. Do you know what? The easiest thing is for me to double check that and come back to you. So if whoever's asked that question, if you just shoot me an email or contact BABS and ask them, I will try and get back to you about that and come back to you with an absolute concrete answer, because I'd rather not give misinformation if possible. That's probably the easiest way to go on this.
Brilliant. That's all of the questions for now. So Sean, I'll leave you to wrap up, and thank you very much for the session.
Thank you very much, Rob. Thank you very much for attending. If you do have any more questions, you can contact me. My website, Facebook and Twitter are there. And please feel free to ask questions. I'll get back to you as quickly as I can. And yeah, I hope you found this helpful, and hopefully see most of you in about 15 minutes for the next session. Thank you very much to Rob for producing and all his hard work, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.